Alright guys, we're going to get started. We're going to do our session today is on escrow instructions. Another relatively dry topic, so we're going to try to spice it up as much as we can. But again, somewhat of a dry topic. Now, if you're watching this on the video, we've got two videos that you need to watch before you watch this one. And that's going to be the contracts class, purchase agreement and contracts, and then the offer negotiation and presentation class, because it kind of flows into this. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about with the escrow instructions literally flows from the contracts we've done. So with that in mind, what I have on the screen, I've got basically 7 pages of standard escrow instructions. When I say standard, this is the typical run-of-the-mill boilerplate escrow. Okay. Now, one thing. Let me pull this up and let's back up just a little bit. When we were meeting yesterday, and we did our contract offer presentation class. Let me just pull up an example. On our purchase contract, at the top of our purchase contract has the find this. Sure. Okay. California residential purchase contract and joint escrow instructions. Okay. The purchase contract is the escrow instructions. All right. Having said that, most escrow companies, and frankly including ours, including Town and Country Escrow, which is broker owned, we don't really acknowledge the contract as the escrow instructions. We acknowledge the fact that that's what the intent is, but in effect what we're going to do, and you're going to see this in the escrow instructions, we're going to restate a whole bunch of things. Okay? So for example, matter of fact, let me show you a different way of doing it. Let me show you if you have an escrow company that will use the purchase contract as the escrow instructions, you will get instructions that look a little bit more similar. Is this the one I want? I don't think so. No, it's not. Let's try this one. Okay. You'll get an instruction that looks more similar to what this is. And this is an escrow acceptance letter from Chicago Title. Again, this is an old one. This goes back to 2005, but more or less it's the same. And the escrow acceptance letter is basically going to be a letter from the escrow company that says we've opened the escrow and we are accepting your language in the purchase agreement. In this particular case, page 7, paragraph 26A. Now keep in mind, this is a little old, the contract has changed, so the numbers may be a little bit different. But the concept basically is the same. Escrow is saying we accept the California Residential Purchase Contract, the RPA, as the escrow instructions, and that's what we're going to use. Okay? Now, even though they may give you this acceptance letter, they'll give you 25 pages of more stuff. Okay? And in this particular case, of the 25 pages, they're actually giving us a copy of the original CAR form, the counteroffer form, and the whole 9 yards. So they've incorporated the offer into the escrow instructions because it is the escrow instructions. Now, that's really going to be a function of who is going to be the escrow company. If it's a concern to you one way or the other, ask them in advance. I will tell you, generally speaking, it doesn't matter. Okay, it should not really. It doesn't matter to me as the broker whether the escrow company sends you an acceptance letter saying we accept the contract as the escrow instructions, or whether the escrow company sends you what most escrow companies do. They go back to the way we've always done it, which is, and it seems a little silly, what they'll do is they'll take the purchase contract and they basically copy the pertinent pieces of the purchase contract out and they put it into their own escrow instructions. You'll find most escrow companies prefer to type their own escrow instructions, frankly because they don't trust us agents. They don't trust that we've done a good job with the purchase contract. And frankly, they're probably, in some cases, they're probably proven right. So, in this particular case, we've got a basic set of escrow instructions. This is from our in-house escrow. Summer's our escrow officer, which, by the way, speaking of kind of tying into the way we ended yesterday's class on presenting offers, if you are not developing close relationships with the escrow officer you're doing business with, and their assistants and their receptionists and all the rest of that, you're missing out, okay? It's just as important, and in many cases more important, for you to have a good, close working relationship with your escrow officer as it is with the other agent on the other side of the fence, okay? A good escrow officer will make you a lot of money. A bad escrow officer will lose you money, okay? They can save deals for you, they can kill deals for you. You need them to go the extra mile, you need something recorded, you need something ran to title. Well, maybe that's a title issue, well maybe, maybe not. You have a great relationship with the escrow officer, but maybe in this particular transaction you don't have a great relationship with whoever the title company is. But guess who does have a good relationship with the title company? Your escrow officer. Hey, Summer, I really need a favor. Can you move the earth and the sun and the stars on this deal to get this thing recorded? Or can you get this done for me? So, again, that relationship is important. And even if it's an escrow you've never done business with, I strongly recommend, just like we said, go to the listing agent's office if you're representing the buyer, introduce yourself. It's not a bad idea to go to the escrow company, introduce yourself, put a name. It's amazing what people will do for you when they put a face to you, okay? And it's also amazing what they'll do when they put a voice to you. You send them an email, there's no connection, I gotta tell you, develop those relationships. So at any rate, so here's our escrow. In this particular case, this is a broker-owned escrow. This is our escrow instructions. So you will have language like a non-independent broker-owned escrow. That just says that we're broker-owned. If you're dealing with ABC escrow or Department of Corporations type escrow, then you'll have those words independent, non-broker-owned escrow, basically is what they're referring to there. Not necessarily a big deal, but you'll know you're dealing with a broker-owned escrow if you see the words non-independent, and if you see a Department of Real Estate license number in there somewhere, okay? So if you're dealing with our escrow in-house, you're going to see that. If you are dealing with, you know, ABC Realty's escrow company, you're going to see that for them. Otherwise, of course, the big boys, you know, First American and Chicago, those are all DOC escrows, okay? To throw some acronyms around that you may or may not be familiar with, new real estate agents always get embarrassed because someone will throw out a 3 or 4 letter acronym and oh yeah, of course, you know, I understand that. Okay, DOC escrow, DOC Department of Corporations, okay? So if you're in that exchange back and forth with another agent and they ask the question, well, is the escrow DOC, Department of Corporations? That's all they're talking about. Separate, independent, third party, and what that means is the escrow is not supervised isn't the word I'm looking for, regulated by the Department of Corporations, okay? If it is a DRE escrow, DRE Department of Real Estate, what that means is that the escrow itself is a broker-owned escrow, like ours is, and we are regulated by the Department of Real Estate, not the Department of Corporations. So there's some alphabet soup for you on what the acronyms mean, okay? Now normally, when you're looking at escrow instructions, you'll find that normally the first page of the escrow instructions almost looks exactly the same. There is a fairly strict boilerplate language that all escrow companies use. And they normally start off exactly the same way, identifying who is the buyer, who is the seller, and one of the questions that came up in our previous class is, how is the buyer going to hold title? What is their vesting going to be? So in this particular case, we've got Raul and Donnie Robles. Vesting to be determined prior to close of escrow, hereinafter known as buyer. Do we already have an amendment that needs to be drawn? We already have an amendment that needs to be drawn in this escrow. Now, is this common? Very common. But frankly, why not figure this out before you write the contract, before you open the escrow? Because right off the bat, there's another piece of paper that's going to need to be generated, and you're going to have to sit down at some point, or at least ask your buyer to open up an email and sign and return. If you had known what Mr. and Mrs. Robles' vesting was going to be, it would say in there, you know, Robles as husband and wife as joint tenants, whatever it happens to be. But we've already got, kind of like we were trying not to generate a counter offer to the offer, well, we've already got at least one amendment to the escrow instructions, and we haven't even got past the first one. So, at any rate, in my opinion, and again, this is happening all the time. This doesn't make the buyer's agent a bad agent, but it would be a lot more efficient if they had had that information in advance. Now they got to chase it down. Okay, so we got to figure out what the buyer's vesting is going to be. They agree to purchase the property from Mr. and Mrs. Owner, Mr. and Mrs. Co. Now, title already knows what their vesting is, and they've even listed it, husband and wife as joint tenants. Where did title get that? Probably got it off of a prelim or some sort of title information. So they pulled it up. Normally, this, from a listing agent's perspective, it's not really something that's really important for us to gather at the time we're selling the property. Oh, by the way, I'm listing your house. How do you guys hold title? I suppose it would be interesting to know, but it's not really the type of thing that I, as in a normal course of taking a listing, really care about. If I needed to know it, I can call title. We can have it instantly because it's all a matter of public record. So the escrow officer pulled that up. Husband and wife joint tenants, that's the seller. And they are hereinafter referred to as the seller. Of the real property set forth herein on the terms and conditions and considerations and instructions hereinafter stated, yada yada yada. The seller and the buyer shall deliver these signed escrow instructions to Town and Country Escrow, hereinafter referred to as escrow holder. Now, we talked yesterday in the previous class about contract, okay? The California Residential Purchase Agreement, purchase contract, is the legally binding contract. Nowhere in the escrow instructions, go back up to the top, will you find the word contract. This is not a contract, okay? The contract between the buyer and seller is the purchase contract, the purchase agreement, the RPA, okay? So the reason I point that out is if there is a conflict between the contract and the escrow instructions, the contract always prevails, okay? If for some reason the buyers and the sellers end up suing each other and they end up in court, the judge is not going to say, give me a copy of your escrow instructions, okay? Probably not interested in even seeing a copy of the escrow instructions. They're going to want to see what the contract says, okay? Because this is not a contract between the buyer and the seller. These are exactly what the title says. These are instructions to the escrow holder. Neutral, third party, unbiased party that basically does what they're told. If you do this, then do that. If that happens, then do this. And then ultimately, the end goal is to do what? Close the deal. So if all of these things happen in the instructions, then the escrow holder is instructed to close the deal. If these things don't happen in the instructions, then the deal don't close. So again, this is not a contract, but now I don't have the purchase contract to mirror the escrow instructions, but let's pretend we do, and let's pretend for at least page 1 that the data is correct. This is why you will hear me say over and over and over in all of these classes, read the paperwork, read the contract, read the escrow instructions, read the preliminary title report, read the inspections, read the whatever, the disclosures, okay? Because right off the bat, you could potentially realize there was a mistake that was made. Initial deposit. This should come straight off of the purchase contract, purchase agreement, the RPA. If the contract says $2,500, bam, we've got $2,500, okay? Deposit prior to close of escrow. Now, be careful with the language. Previously, when we were talking in the purchase contract, I made a distinction between earnest money deposit and down payment. Okay, I made a very succinct differential between earnest money deposit and the balance of the down payment. In this set of escrow instructions, it doesn't really make a distinction between the two. What it does say is initial deposit $2,500, deposit buyer, think of it this way, the buyer is to deposit prior to close of escrow $7,275, which basically in this particular case is giving us, actually maybe I might take back what I just said.
No.
That may very well be additional deposit, okay? I don't have the contract to see, but if that's what the contract says, so be it. Now we have total cash through escrow, and they're asking for an addition, oh, I take it back, never mind. The total cash through escrow is both of those items listed. So in effect, this is probably a FHA deal. Maybe we'll figure that out a little bit farther down when we get into the instructions. But the total amount of money that the buyer is asking to be put forward so far is $9,775. That should be what shows up on page 1 of the purchase contract. If that's not, then you already have a problem. The loan, new encumbrance, first trustee, second trustee, third trustee, in this case, one loan. The loan is $132,725. That should be what appears on page 1 of the purchase contract, purchase agreement, okay? So if these numbers aren't matching up, then you have a problem. Getting back to our prior example when we had that offer that was written and it appeared as though it was written all cash, right? Okay? If the buyer's agent, well, the buyer's agent obviously wrote it incorrectly. The listing agent accepts it, right? Then they send that purchase contract over to escrow. Escrow types this up. There's no place on that contract that said first trustee. Escrow automatically has a problem. So right from the very beginning there's an issue, which is why it's so important to have that correct. Okay? Now obviously total consideration, that's your sales price. You add them up and you've got $142,500. All of this information should come straight off page 1 of your contract. If you do it wrong, you're already off to a challenging start. Okay, now this reads basically as if, think of it as escrow instructions. I'm instructing you to do something. That's how this kind of reads. This is basically talking in the form of the buyer, the seller, in the form of the escrow. Furthermore, or in addition to these terms, we've got a few more things that we got to talk about. Okay? I will execute and deliver any instructions and or funds which this escrow requires to show title as it's called for, all of which you are instructed to use on or before. What is this?
Close of escrow.
That's our close of escrow date. Okay? So instructed to use on or before December 30th, 2011. So this particular escrow is supposed to close at month end. Which again, getting back to writing contracts, choosing escrow closing dates. If I had my choice, let me pull up my calendar here real quick. On balance, are you setting yourself up for a problem to try to close on the absolute last working day of the calendar year?
Yes.
Are there some reasons why a buyer or a seller absolutely positively has to close before the end of the year? Otherwise maybe the deal makes no sense.
Tax purposes.
Tax purposes, there's a variety of reasons. But you need to know in advance. If I'm representing a buyer, if I'm representing a seller, and I have consciously chose a close of escrow date of the last day of the year, I had better have a good long conversation with my client and say, wow, is that really what we want to do? Do you plan on taking any holiday time at all? What about the escrow company? What about the lender? What about the termite guy? What about the title guy? How many people does it take to make an escrow work? Think about this.
A lot.
Buyers, at least one buyer, at least one seller, at least one listing agent, maybe an assistant, a buyer's agent, maybe an assistant, an escrow officer, maybe an assistant, a title officer, maybe an assistant, I'm already at to 10, a termite guy, home inspector. Who else have we got? I missed a few people at least. Well, come on, who else have we got? The guy who runs down and maybe has to record it. There's probably 4 or 5 other people. Okay? So I would say there's a minimum of probably 15 people. Some of them with varying levels of importance. But guess what? They all have to be nodding yes up and down at the same time. They all have to be working. Oh, we left out the whole loan company. We didn't mention the lender. We've got the processor, we've got the lender, we've got the gal who draws the loan documents, we've got the underwriter over on the side, we've got the appraiser. Oh my gosh, okay? Now we're at 15, 16. Then we were forgetting the big one, okay? All of these people have to be working in unison in order to make this happen. Which again, is why when I'm writing these offers, going back to our contract class, I'm always looking at the calendar. What is a reasonable period of time to get this closed? And why in the world would I want to do it? Christmas Day is the Sunday before. Is everybody going to be back to work on Monday? A lot of people aren't going to be back to work until January probably 3rd. Okay? Let's assume everybody's working. Is everybody going to be working on the 30th, even if they work that day? A lot of people, I don't even know if the recorder's office is open all day on the 30th. Anyway, we have to think that stuff through. It's just so, don't set ourselves up to fail if we don't have to.
And even if they are open, a lot of times government offices will close early.
Kind of close
like
early.
Before a holiday like that.
Setting ourselves up. Okay, so we're going to close the last day of the month. We're also going to provide you, provided you have a title policy. So we've got a title insurance policy. So basically what this is saying, when it says I will execute and deliver instructions, who is I in this?
The buyer.
Buyer and seller. Okay? Because buyer and seller are going to be the ones who are going to sign this. So when I sign the bottom, I am the I as the buyer. If I sign as the seller, I am the I. Okay? So I am going to deliver signed documents. I am going to deliver funds if that's what I'm told to do. I am going to be prepared to close on December 30th of 2011. Again, and it says, provided you, who is you in this? Whenever they say you, when they say you, they're talking to the escrow company. So this is the buyer saying, I will do this, escrow company, as long as you do that. And the you in this particular case is, you, escrow, has to hold a policy of title insurance. So think of this as a dialogue between the escrow company and the buyer and the seller. Okay? So at any rate, we're gonna try to close the last day of the month, last day of the year. Escrow is going to provide title, which has to be clear, with usual title companies exceptions, which we're going to talk about in a minute. What is the usual title companies exceptions? Is it possible that you will have a buyer or a seller, specifically in this case a buyer, say, well, what are the usual exceptions? That doesn't sound like I want to know what the usual exceptions are. When you give me a title policy, I want to make sure, which by the way, do most of the sellers and buyers even know what a title insurance policy is? They have no idea. No idea. And which is why we have a whole 2-hour class on preliminary title insurance, which explains exactly what that is. And we're going to do that one, I think, next. So, but at any rate, so we're going to give them a title insurance policy which basically ensures that the property's title can transfer with no negative impact on the new owner of the property. No liens from the former mortgage holders. No violations of non-compliance from the city. All of those lovely little things, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch more. Okay, so you need to know what that usual is. With a liability of not less than $142,500, that magically happens to be the sales price. Okay? So we are going to insure the property for the purchase price. Makes sense? That's how it works. And then of course the title insurance rates, the amount that the buyers and sellers pay, are based upon sales price. Okay? The larger the sales price, the more expensive the policy. Very simple. Just like insuring a car. The more expensive the car, the more expensive the policy. The more risk. Okay, covering the property. And they've got, this is where I always get the legal description. Okay, so they always will give you the nice, brings back memories of your real estate exam. Lot 62, tract number 229, blah, 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 blah. So this is important. If you have run a property profile on the property and you have your own property profile, it's probably not a bad idea to take 10 seconds, pull your profile out, match it up to make sure these are human beings that type these. Okay? If there's a typo, and where do these escrow instructions go to, by the way, after they're signed by the buyer and seller? Title company,
Bank.
lender, okay? If we don't have this information accurate, or if it's in some way wrong, people are going to be heading in different directions, and then normally it throws us off course completely, or it does one of those lovely, oops, we have to retype the grant deed, and we, guess what, we were ready to close on the last day of the year. Everybody was ready to roll. We were going to meet the big deadline for the taxes. We needed to get it closed. And guess what happened? We had the wrong legal description typed on the grant deed, and it got caught the last day. Which means what?
Not going to close on.
Correct it. We're not going to close on time. And now potentially, if that date really is critical, and by the way, you will have these deals, by the way. You will be buying and or acting as the listing buyer's agent, seller's agent. And there will be transactions, I've had several of these, where if the deal did not close in the calendar year, there was no deal. Okay? And that's exactly what the contract said. It will close. This is not, we'll give you a 5-day extension because the deed was messed up. If it doesn't close by year end, deal's off. And the only reason it didn't close by year end in this example is because we had some transposition of some numbers. Read the escrow instructions. It takes not that much time. Read them. Okay, so we've got a legal description, and then of course we have the commonly known as, which is your address. Okay, make sure you read it. Make sure it's correct. I think I gave an example in a class or two ago. Honest, true story. Buyers and the buyer's agent were in escrow on 2 different houses. Getting ready to do the final walkthrough. I'll meet you at the house at 3 o'clock. The buyer's agent rolls up, parks in front of the house, and waits. Huh, my buyer's late. That's strange. They're never late. Looks down the street, across the street and 10 houses down. Huh, that looks like their car. Okay? The buyers were on the same street, 10 houses down on the opposite side. They had shown 2 properties. They got back to the office. Total misunderstanding as to which property they actually wanted. They were under contract with house 726, and the buyer really wanted house 701. Okay? Read it. Go through that stuff. True story. True story. Okay, showing title investing. We've already dealt with this. This is a repetition of what I set up earlier. Here's our buyer's name, vesting to be determined. We already have an amendment like we've already discussed. Subject to. These are the usual things. When you want a definition of title, policy of title insurance with the usual title company exceptions, these are the usual title company's exceptions. So when you have a buyer that reads that, and by the way, why do we need to read our escrow instructions? Well, if for no other reason, sometimes your buyers and sellers will read them. Okay? It is not professional for your buyer or seller to point out mistakes. It's much more professional for you to call your buyer and seller and say, hey, just in case you haven't read them yet, I wanted you to know. I looked over the escrow instructions. There's an error. Don't worry about it. I'm going to get it fixed. Especially the obvious ones. There will be mistakes in these. Let's just take a simple one. The purchase price is wrong. The escrow officer transposes a number and they shorted the seller $20,000 and the buyer thinks, wow, I'm going to get a great deal. Will you have clients that will call you up furious? Not everybody's easy going. Not everybody's, no big deal, just must have been a mistake, they'll get it fixed. People get edgy on this stuff. They'll call you up in a panic, freaked out. What happened? That's not what we agreed to. I know, calm down, it's okay. Believe me, you're better off pointing out these mistakes to them than having them point them out to you. Okay, some of the usual exceptions, here they are. This is basically boilerplate language. If you've closed more than 2 escrows, go back and take a look at both of your escrow instructions. This is pretty much word for word. If you've closed 102 escrows, they're going to be word for word, pretty much exactly the same. Okay, subject to. And what they're saying, subject to, is they're taking title to the property. Let's go back up here. Read this like a novel here. Here's our property, showing they're going to issue a title policy for this property vested in these buyers, subject to the following conditions. And the following conditions are very simple. General and special county, city, if any, taxes for the current fiscal year not due. These will always be listed on the preliminary title report. Another thing which we will discuss and you need to read. If there are any general or special county and or city taxes for the current fiscal year, they will appear on the title, the title report, the preliminary title report, the prelim. Okay? Another one of those acronyms. I don't mean to talk down to anybody, but if you're new to the business and you hear the word prelim, well, prelim is the short version of preliminary title report. Okay? These items will show up on the preliminary title report. So, taxes. Now that does not mean that the buyer is going to have the seller pay their taxes or vice versa. This gets back to prorations, and we talked about prorations in yesterday's class as well. All that this says is on the preliminary title report, there's going to be taxes on the prelim, and those have to be dealt with. Okay, and it could be Melrose taxes. They could be community assessment districts. Maybe they just built an off-ramp off the freeway and they put a special assessment district for this block of houses. There's crazy stuff that you'll find on the prelim. Some tract of homes are paying for irrigation for a strip of land in the middle of the street. Others are paying for a light pole. Someone put a light pole up and there wasn't a light pole there before. And now everybody gets to pay $25.72 for 30 years to pay for the light pole. I mean, all of this stuff is what this is referring to. Okay? So, we first have taxes, if any, which there always will be. Lien of supplemental taxes, if any. Okay? And again, I kind of jumped ahead. The supplemental taxes could be those things I just talked about. The extra supplemental tax for the off-ramp on the freeway, or for the light poles, or for the landscaping median, or whatever. So those are on there all the time. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Reservations, easements. Actually, let's stop right here. Covenants, conditions, restrictions. Normally people see or hear CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, restrictions, CC&Rs, and they think homeowners associations. Okay? You need to be careful. Do you have to have let me rephrase this. If you have CC&Rs, do you automatically have a homeowners association? No. Now the reverse is true. If you have a homeowners association, you definitely have CC&Rs. But just because, and again, this, by the way, this is the escrow instructions. This does not say whether or not there are CC&Rs. This just says there could be. Where are we going to find this information? Preliminary title report. Separate document. So what this is telling the buyer and the seller is, specifically the buyer, you're going to take title to this property subject to what could be CC&Rs. This should tell the buyer's agent and the buyer, and later on it's going to tell them to read the prelim. Read the prelim. Look for covenants, conditions, and restrictions. If you see on the prelim, which by the way, let me clear up what I said before. There are lots of subdivisions all over the place that have CC&Rs, but there's not a homeowners association there. When the developer built the property, they put in certain covenants, conditions, and restrictions, but they did not form an association to go with it. Okay? Most commonly, people, when they think CC&Rs, they automatically think homeowners association. Okay? Not the case. But many times that's the case, especially in Southern California. So at any rate, this is basically putting everybody on guard. Look out for CC&Rs. If you see CC&Rs then in the prelim, and we'll talk about that in the next class, then what do you need to do? If it says in the prelim there are CC&Rs, this property is subject to CC&Rs, then what? Pull them. Get a copy of them. And then you get to read them. And then normally once you have the CC&Rs in front of you, then it will tell you if the CC&Rs are just general CC&Rs, or whether the CC&Rs are tied in one form or another to a homeowners association. okay? Which is a big deal. Do buyers close escrow on houses not realizing that they just bought a house in a homeowners association? Does that happen? As unlikely as that sounds, and as actually as almost impossible as that sounds, it happens all the time. I've had it happen in transactions that I've been involved in probably a dozen times, okay? And that should never happen. Agents failing, escrows failing, title company failing, but at the end of the day, the main failure is people are not reading the paperwork. They just didn't read it. They didn't read the instructions, they didn't read the prelim, and they certainly didn't read the CC&Rs, because if they had seen them, they would have seen, this is part of the ABC Homeowners Association. Okay, also over here, easements for public utilities. Does almost every single property that we're ever going to sell have an easement of some sort or another on it? Absolutely. You're going to have easements for Southern California Edison, Eastern Municipal Water, gas company, cable companies, companies that we've never heard of. It's funny now, you read these, back when I first started, General Telephone, I mean, they were the big GTE. I mean, they were it. GTE I don't think exists, at least in the way it did before. They've been gobbled up by AT&T or Verizon or whatever it happens to be. But when you look at a prelim, all of these easements are in the names of
The old
old companies that you don't even know. What, who the heck's General Telephone Company? Okay. Well, at any rate, you have all of these different easements, utilities, districts, that could be for a water district or what have you, water companies, alleys, got an alley going down the back of the property, a street that runs through, rights of way. Again, most of us are probably more familiar with selling single-family houses in specific tracts. Pretty simple, but you venture off a little bit out the beaten neighborhood and you've got maybe a paved road or a dirt road on a 2-acre parcel. Well, it's entirely possible that there's an easement for the parcel in the back to use your driveway, which nobody has used in years because that lot doesn't seem to use it, and then all of a sudden it shows up on a You need to know that. You need to know it because maybe the buyer of the property plans on putting a barn right in that corner of the property. Okay? It's kind of a big deal. Oh, absolutely. I'm buying this property because I'm training for the Olympics. And my intention is when I buy this 2-acre parcel, I'm going to put an Olympic-sized swimming pool in this because I am going to be swimming every day in training. And I'm going to put it there, and it's going to go there and there. Okay. Well, what if there's an easement for a utility line? Is that buyer going to be able to put their swimming pool there? No, they're not. Is that going to be a deal killer? Yes, it is. Read the paperwork. Very important. Also, of course, it's the traditional mineral, oil, and gas and water rights, which we all wish we buy property and have access or rights to that. But in most cases, those have already been claimed years and years and years ago. All right, those are some of your land restrictions. And then this is also almost always the case, especially, of course, when you have a buyer that's getting a new loan. One of the exceptions on the title is going to be there's going to be a new loan on the property for the buyer in this particular case for $132,725 in favor of, if we know who the lender is, in this case it says in favor of lender of buyer's choice. It could say Bank of America if they knew who it was. But if that says $132,725, then this had better say $132,725. They need to match. Is it possible that you could have a typo somewhere? Sure. So you're always going to have these subject to clauses. Always. Okay? Then when you get to instructions to escrow, this is the part where normally escrow starts to freelance a little bit. Okay? And normally what they'll end up doing, again, most of this, by the way, is boilerplate. They're just changing a word or a dollar amount. So you'll especially... And again, it's so similar from one escrow company to the other escrow company. They kind of all go to the same template to pull this information up. But here are our instructions. Buyer's closing costs. Escrow holder is hereby instructed that the buyer shall pay usual buyer's costs. I love that word. Well, what are the usual buyer's costs? Okay, well, it's going to list a few of them. As incurred in this type of transactions, which may include but are not limited to. Okay? the lender's policy of title insurance. Now, if you're representing the buyer, and if you remember the purchase contract class that we did a couple days ago, on page 2, allocation of cost, you probably checked the box on the contract that said seller to pay for the title insurance. Right? Now, if you did not point out to the buyer the little line underneath that sentence that's not checked, and the little line underneath that in parentheses says, buyer will be responsible for any title fees associated with lender's coverage, your buyer could read the again, they're still on page 1. Your buyer looks at that and says, wait a minute, it looks like they're talking about charging me for the lender's title insurance policy. Are they talking about charging the buyer for the lender's title insurance policy? Yes, they are. So you don't want this to be a surprise, and when your buyer, if you haven't fully explained that to your buyer when you're going through the offer. Recording fees. Well, what are recording fees? Recording fees are fees that are charged normally by the escrow and/or the county recorder's office to record documents. Okay, we record a few documents in an escrow. You record the grant deed, transferring title from the seller to the buyer. You normally will also record the deed of trust. That's the loan that the lender says, I'm going to loan, in this case, the buyer, whatever it is, $130,000. And then we record a deed of trust against the property. The fees are minimal. I mean, I don't know, 30, 20, 40, 50 bucks, whatever it happens to be. Okay? But depending upon who would pay for the fee to record the deed of trust, whose deed of trust is it? The buyer's deed of trust. So, kind of that's what they're saying. Somebody has to pay to record that. Okay? So they got recording fees, notary fees. Do escrow officers charge notary fees? Most of the time they do. Escrow officers kind of like that. It's almost like a little Benny of being an escrow officer. You know, they get their whatever wage they get, and guess what? A buyer or seller comes in and, hey, guess what? Give me $10 per signature. Some companies will pass that on or waive it as kind of a little a nicety for coming and working with that escrow officer. But most escrow officers are charging notary fees. Well, whoever signs that document is going to pay for those. Escrow-related fees. Well, what's that? Well, loan tie-in fees. Well, what's a loan tie-in fee? A loan tie-in fee is nothing more than the escrow company and the title company and the lender tying in this loan into the transaction. I don't know. It's a fee. Normally it's $125, 200 bucks. Normally it goes either to a lender or an escrow company as a loan fee. I affectionately refer to these as garbage fees. And I tell that word to my client. Oh, by the way, we're going to have garbage fees. Huh? What's a garbage fee? Well, a loan tie-in fee to me is a garbage fee. You know, it's just one of those things. You just throw on a little extra. See if we can pick up an extra $125. So know who your escrow company is. Don't let your escrow company rip off your clients. Okay? Don't let the lender rip off your clients. People associated with transactions more times than they should, which more than once is too many, but you know, they sometimes try to just get in the pocket, you know, and let's get some money here. Keep an eye. This is another reason you need to know what all these fees are. When you see something that pops up that's out of line, maybe the fee itself is a normal fee, but your history says that should be about $100, and then you see it charged $400. You're the professional. You need to know that's out of line. You need to be prepared to pick up that phone, talk to the escrow, talk to the lender, talk to the title, whoever the offending fee charger is, and say, that's unreasonable. We don't accept that. $100 is industry standard, so to speak. Got to be careful when you're talking like that with fees. But if it's unreasonable, you need to know. Wire fees. Who has wire fees? Buyers could have wire fees. Sellers could have wire fees. Wire money in, wire money out. Okay? Buyers want to wire money in for down payment and closing costs. Lenders wire funds in to title to close escrows. Sellers say, hey, when I close escrow, wire my money into my account. Well, you got to pay for that. And as silly as it may sound, you will have clients, if you haven't already had clients, you have done the best possible job of any real estate agent on the planet. They will get their HUD-1. HUD-1 is the final closing statement, okay? And there will be a charge on there for $35, a wire fee. And all of the goodwill and good work that you think you've built up with your client over the prior 6 months is gone. And they will call you absolutely livid because there's a $35 down. Then maybe the fee's reasonable. But again, you need to explain all of these things, which is why when you're doing your seller's net sheet and when you're doing your buyer's estimated costs, okay, you need to cover all this stuff. And frankly, and I tell my clients all the time, I'm giving you an estimated debt sheet, seller's proceeds, if I'm representing the seller. I'm giving you an estimated funds to close, closing costs if I'm representing the buyer. Oh, and by the way, I'm listing everything individually. Oh, and by the way, I'm actually increasing the numbers a little bit. So in other words, if the fee should be $100, I'm going to say $120. If I think the fee is $1,200, I'm going to maybe put $1,350. And I tell the client that because I don't want any surprises. So if I tell you it should be $1,300, when you get your closing statement, I want that fee to say $1,250. Then I'm a hero. Okay? And the reverse is also true. So be careful. You start quoting those numbers. If you said the escrow fee was going to be $875 and it turns out to be $975, who comes back to you? And I got to tell you, you will have the spectrum of clients. You will have clients that could care less. Oh, whatever, no, $800 no deal. And then you will have clients that will chase you down for a quarter. So know what those fees are. Okay, so where was I? We had Federal Express fees. Yes, you want a Federal Express. Escrow doesn't do this stuff for free. You got all these things going back. Hey, we need a courier. I need a courier to run documents to, Los Angeles. Now, it used to be in the old days that the title companies did a lot of this stuff for us, and it was wonderful, and there was very little, if any, fees or whatever charged back. Can't do that a lot anymore. All the RESPA laws and the Reg Z laws have changed a lot of that. So almost anybody who's going anywhere to file a FedEx fee or a courier fee or something like that, there's going to be a fee. Okay? So guess who sometimes needs to be the courier? Us. But I don't necessarily mean going from here to Los Angeles. You may, depending upon the size of the deal and the size of the commission, and your client's in Texas, you need to get something done and you got to close on the 30th of the last day of the month, or this deal isn't going to close. And the only way that's going to happen is if somebody physically flies to Dallas, meets them at the airport, and flies back. I don't know, what's that going to cost you? It's going to cost you a day's worth of time and $400 a round-trip ticket? Well, who's the professional? Maybe not in every deal that doesn't make sense, but in some transactions you may need to do that. So raise the bar. Okay, lender's fees, credit reports, appraisals. We have a transaction going right now. Our close of escrow date is tomorrow. Found out day before yesterday we don't have an appraisal. So my initial reaction was, well, shame on that lender. Let's get this lender going, put some fire under them. And then I find out, well, the reason we don't have an appraisal is because the buyer does not have the money, the $450, to pay the lender to order the appraisal. I'm 3 days away from close of escrow. A little bit of follow-up, a little bit of contact management, a little bit of relationship between the client, the lender, the escrow. What's going on here? Why do I not have my appraisal contingency waived? Which, by the way, what's the default in the contract, the RPA, to remove the appraisal contingency? 17 days. I'm at least 30 days into this transaction. Not only have they not waived the appraisal contingency, they haven't even ordered the appraisal yet. Do I feel good right now? Does my seller feel good right now? Does my seller feel like I've given them good representation? Have I? I haven't. I failed my seller in that case. I needed to be more on top of that buyer's agent and that lender. And that one slipped by us. Sometimes that costs you a little bit of money, sometimes it costs you a lot. So again, always learning in this business. Okay, what else do we need? Funds to establish impounds. What are impounds? I'm a buyer, I'm buying a house, I'm reading this. By the way, this is not a, and sometimes when you read this, actually it does, I apologize. Buyer's closing costs. Okay, seller's down here. So this is specifically talking to the buyer. Funds to establish impounds.
Mortgage insurance?
Mortgage insurance, taxes, homeowners insurance, not normally homeowners association, that's normally been different. This is why when you tell a buyer, hey, you know, $100,000 sales price, 20% down, you need $20,000 to buy this house, right? Well, you need $20,000 down payment, plus. Okay? Who's going to tell you what the impounds are going to be?
Escrow.
Lender. Well, escrow will kind of figure it out and package it for you. But normally that information is going to come from the lender. So if you're representing the buyer, know your lender. Have a good relationship. If you ever have a transaction where you get to close of escrow and the escrow company calls your buyer and says, hey, you need to wire in the balance of the closing funds, you need X amount of dollars, and the buyer says, what? That's $5,000 more than I was expecting. After you look in the mirror and you kick yourself, then you need to assess whether or not you're working with the right lender. Because primarily it's your fault. Okay? Now we can deflect and blame the lender for not providing a proper good faith estimate to the buyer and so on and so forth. But that's your responsibility. You should never have a buyer that's surprised by how much money they need to close escrow. As you should never have a seller that's surprised on what their proceeds are going to be at close of escrow. Okay? You need to know that. Okay, so we got impounds. 1 year hazard insurance. Is homeowners insurance paid in advance? Yes. It's paid in advance. They got to pay that up front. At least get it in the impounds. And any other, there's that lovely word, I hate that word. Any other usual buyer's costs incurred. So basically here's the kitchen sink. So if your buyer now reads this and says, please clarify for me what this means, get with your escrow company and actually scratch that. They should know the answer to this question before escrow's open, and frankly they should know the answer to this question before the purchase contract is even written and accepted. Okay? They have an application pending with the lender, they have a good faith in their hand, you're sitting down to writing an offer with them, and if you don't have it in writing, you've got the lender on the phone. Tell me exactly how much money do Mr. and Mrs. Buyer need to close escrow if we write this offer and it gets accepted today. Lender says, "Buh, great, you're going to send it over to me in writing in a good faith estimate." Yes. Have the buyer call me, we're going to do an application, we're going to get it going. Whatever that number is here. No surprises. Are there always surprises? Yes, always surprises. Okay, seller's cost. Escrow holder, talking to the seller now, is further instruction that the seller shall pay, there's that word again, usual seller's costs as incurred in this type of transaction. What type of transaction are we doing, by the way? We're doing a residential sale. Is that type of transaction maybe different than selling a commercial building?
Sure.
Are the fees a little different? Are there different usual costs? Isn't that tricky? In this type of transaction, you're going to have a client who's going to ask you this. Well, I keep saying over and over, in this type of transaction. What kind of transaction am I doing? And what's the difference between this type and that type? You need to get this. You need to absorb as much of this as you can. Okay, which may include but are not limited to owner's title insurance policy. Is this specifically spelled out in the contract? Yes, there's a box. Check seller, check buyer. Okay? Normally it's being checked buyer, so the seller. The seller is going to pay for it. They're going to pay for escrow-related fees, document prep, payoff and demand fees. What is a payoff and demand fees? I'm the seller. I have a loan with Bank of America for $200,000. I'm selling my house. When I sell the house, what's going to happen to my $200,000 loan? It's going to get paid off. Now I need to know, escrow needs to know exactly how much is the payoff. Okay? Now I have a statement, my mortgage statement, and I look at it and it says, well, $201,017.18. Is that the payoff and the demand fee? No. Is it close? Yeah, it's close, but that's not the number. If I am in escrow, escrow will send a payoff / demand. By the way, those terms will be used kind of interchangeably. You'll see these on escrow and net sheets called a demand. I normally refer to them as a demand. Okay, a lot of times you don't have the word payoff in there, but it's the same thing. If you have a demand fee, all the demand fee is, it's tell us how much you are going to demand to pay off Lance's loan with Bank of America. And then the lender then will send in a formal demand that says, this loan has a balance of X. If it closes on this day, this is how much you pay. For every day thereafter, add $32.72 prorated interest. Okay. In order to do that, does the lender charge me to tell me how much I owe them? Yes, they do. Isn't it great? Tell me how much I owe you. How much do I have to pay you to pay off this loan? Okay, you owe me $201,750.75 plus another $125. Well, what's that for? For me telling you how much you owe me. Garbage fee. Okay? Truly a garbage fee. So that's what that is. So when you see that, oh, by the way, what if there's two loans? Two demand fees. What if they're both with Bank of America? It doesn't matter. Demand fee number one, demand fee for the second. Okay? It's just lovely how everybody wants to get. Again, I guess I could say the same thing about the realtors, but it's just a lovely thing. Okay, so we've got demand fees. Reconveyance fee. You need to know what a reconveyance fee is. If you don't know what a reconveyance fee kind of goes hand in hand with this payoff and demand fee. Now that the lender has told the seller how much they actually owe to close on December 30th of 2011, and by the way, pay us another, which by the way, about between $75 and $150 is a somewhat normal demand. That may sound like a lot of money, I don't know. But that's what I've experienced, and I haven't seen it go up a whole heck of a lot in the last 20 years. But now that we know how much it's going to pay, or how much the seller has to pay, there's another very important element. Once that loan is paid, and again, if you've recently taken your real estate exam, this word hopefully is familiar to you, and that's the reconveyance fee. And again, I don't mean to talk down to everybody, but we're kind of doing lowest common denominator here. The reconveyance fee is, oh, by the way, it's another fee, as you can tell, because it says fee. It's another fee that in our Bank of America example, Bank of America will, in addition to giving them the money to pay, to tell us how much you owe, by the way, you also have to pay us some more money so that we sign the back of the deed of trust, or the note, that says that the loan has now been paid and we record it. So you get to pay to find out how much you owe them, then you get to pay how much you owe them, and then you get to pay again for them to say you don't owe us the money anymore. Garbage fees. Okay? Now again, you may never have to explain this to a client. But the whole reason I'm taking 2 hours to go through these is because if you have a client who asks you what that is, that's the answer. Okay? And you need to commit this stuff to memory. Okay, city and county transfer tax. We talked about this in a prior class. Normally, there's very few cities that have city transfer tax. Riverside does, for example. Moreno Valley doesn't. On balance, most cities do not. Almost every county that I'm aware of has a transfer tax. Riverside County is $1.10 per thousand. You need to know what that is. You need to know how to figure that out. Those are normal, and again, they put that under seller's costs. Oh, by the way, could any of these potentially be buyer's costs?
Yeah.
All negotiable. It's entirely possible. you can negotiate a transaction where the seller says, sure, I'll sell it to you for X, but you pay all my closing costs. If the buyer agrees to that, that's perfectly fine. And of course, which normally it's the reverse. The buyer says, I'll buy it at this price if you pay all my closing costs. But we can flip these over. Again, Federal Express, Courier, Notary Wire, we've already gone through those. And again, and other usual seller's costs incurred. There's that usual word again. Okay, so this covers, again, this is kind of everything, including the kitchen sink. Okay, this is normally fairly boilerplate when you get your escrow instructions. So, now we've got this other thing in here. Buyer's closing costs paid by seller. Somewhere in the RPA, Residential Purchase Agreement contract, the buyer and seller agreed to something. It sounds like in this particular one, seller agrees to pay a portion, which to me says not all, a portion of the buyer's costs not to exceed $2,500. And again, I love these words. When you're drafting your contract or when you're drafting your counteroffer to the contract, these are great words, including but not limited to. You need to remember those and you need to put those in, okay? And in this particular case, title, escrow, recording, loan, fees as required by lender, and blah, 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 blah. Now, whatever is put in here, this needs to make sure it matches what the contract says. So for example, let's pretend there's an error here. Let's say the contract said the seller agrees to pay buyer's closing costs paid by seller, and the contract says $2,500 to be paid towards buyer's loan discount points. Period. Now you come over here and it says seller agrees to pay $2,500 including all this other stuff. Is that a mistake? Absolutely. What if the lender only charges one loan discount point? And what if that loan discount point in this example would only be about $1,300? So the seller doesn't have to pay $2,500, only pay $1,300. Well, if we allow this language in there, which is contrary to the contract, by the way, is that a problem? It's absolutely a problem. Let's use that example for a minute. Let's suppose that this language in the escrow instructions is contradictory to the contract. And let's suppose nobody reads the escrow instructions, and the seller's initial and the buyer's initial, and we now get ready to close escrow, and they're working up an estimated figure, and escrow is ready to charge the seller $2,500. And now at this point in the transaction, somebody decides to read the escrow instructions. Maybe it's the seller. Maybe it's the listing agent. In this particular case, those would be the people who would be in their interest to read it, because they're the ones who are going to get nicked. At least the seller is. They read it, they say, oh, wait a minute. I just noticed the day before close of escrow that you're going to charge the seller, me, $2,500, and now I looked at my contract and there's some conflicting language here. But the seller signed it. I'm going to ask you the trick question. We already talked about this at the very, very beginning of this tape. Is this a contract?
No.
This is not a contract. So I don't care if your buyer or seller signed it. Okay? The contract says we're doing this. I can't tell you how many times buyers and sellers have signed this. 3 days later, 3 weeks later, the day before close of escrow, we discover it. And whoever was the party who was the beneficiary to the mistake, now they're indignant. Well, wait a minute. They said they signed, they're going to pay. Well, it was a mistake. By the way, are we allowed to make mistakes? Absolutely. There's nothing illegal about making mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. Well, now where it becomes costly, and still not illegal, but where it becomes costly is you catch the mistake after close of escrow. Because now somebody's been harmed, and it doesn't make you a bad person. We made a mistake. Oh, crud. Somebody got charged more than they should have, and now we discovered it after close of escrow. That's a problem. Unless the party who was the beneficiary is willing to write a check and say, oops, you're right, we made a mistake, here's $1,200 back. Do people do that willingly? I will tell you, the nicest clients, people that I would describe as some of the nicest clients I've ever had, a mistake was made in the escrow. Escrow is now closed. These are genuinely nice people. I call them after close of escrow to inform them that there's been a mistake in escrow. It accrued to their benefit, and I'm really sorry, we should have caught it in advance, but I need you to, could you please cut a check back to the buyer for $300? You kidding me? Don't return my phone calls. Don't return my emails. They disappear. The nicest clients I've ever had turn into people that, in my opinion, are not doing the right thing. And it's amazing how that happens. Absolutely amazing. Which, by the way, and then normally, who ends up paying for that mistake? Agents, brokers, realtors. We end up paying for that. You know? It's terrible. We have one of those going on right now in the office over a stove. I don't remember the whole particulars of it, but there's a stove, a dispute over a stove. $400 stove. Been talking about it for months. I talked to the agent and said, why are we talking about this? What do you mean? I've spent more time talking about this $400 stove. We have an angry client. Get your checkbook out. We made a mistake. You made a mistake. Get your checkbook out and cut them a check for $400 and send them some flowers and tell them you're sorry. It won't happen again. It's not my fault. And in this particular case, guess what? It wasn't our agent's fault. It was their client's fault. But their client is not doing the right thing. Maybe it's easier to do over $400. Wait till you get the big one. You get the $30,000 one. Okay, or the $50,000. I'll tell you, I'll take a quick time out on the escrow class. And I'll tell you, there's something about this business, which you may have heard me say before. I love this business. This is one of the best businesses on the planet. One of the things I love about this business is the emotions of roller coaster emotions that you get in this business. One of the speakers that I listen to on a regular basis talks about this business will take you from the heights of exhilaration to the depths of despair, literally like that. You have a question?
Yeah.
Quick.
Real quick, because Debbie's updating those MLSs.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, we never talked about if you still want them to send the offers. We don't have a Fannie offers account set up. I'd say just take it out for
Let's
now.
leave it alone for now. We'll fix it. Leave it out for now. We can always go back later and
Sounds
fix it.
good. All right.
Okay, back to my great story. Heights of exhilaration to the depths of despair. If you are not a believer in what you think is who you are, power of positive thinking and all the rest of that sort of stuff, I would think if you think that's nonsense, if you're staying in this real estate business for any period of time, you absolutely will be a believer in the power of positive thinking and the power of what you think is what you are. And this is my story, and I think all of you will relate to this. I closed an escrow for a client, and this particular escrow involved a 1031 exchange. Okay? We're going to do a whole class. As a matter of fact, it's not even on the agenda. We will do a 2-hour class on 1031 exchange. That's a tax-deferred exchange, so a seller can sell a piece of property and basically defer any capital gains tax into the future. If you haven't done one yet, you will. Okay? Even though our real estate market values are down, when things turn around, there's a lot of investors today that are buying properties at great values. They're going to want to turn around and resell them, and they're going to potentially be subject to capital gains tax, and they will come to you and they will say, can you do a 1031 tax deferred exchange for me? And you will say yes, because I am an expert. So at any rate, that's the background. We do a 1031 tax deferred exchange. The difference between doing a 1031 tax deferred exchange and not doing a 1031 tax deferred exchange to my seller was about $40,000 in tax. Okay? So we do the 1031 tax deferred exchange. Tax is deferred. He doesn't have to pay it, at least now. Way, way, way down the road. We don't do it. He's going to have to write a check to the government for $40,000 in April. Okay? escrow's closed. It was a big sale. I had a decent commission. I think I had a $16,000 commission on that transaction. It is, I think, Friday morning. The deal is done. I get the phone call from escrow. The deal is done. I am thrilled. I know I've got a $16,000 check coming to me. Where am I? I am at the heights of exhilaration. Why am I? Which, by the way, 30 seconds before that, I'm just driving down the street. I feel okay, but I don't feel like I'm flying high. I'm just feeling kind of normal. Now I get the phone call with good news. Part of that good news is my client's happy, the escrow's closed, everything's happy, and I get paid. Okay? I am at the heights of exhilaration. I drive for about a half a mile down the road thinking, okay, I got to call my seller and give him the good news. And then I instantly, within 30 seconds, I fall to the depths of despair. And what you think is who you are? There's two things that changed within a 60-second window. I'm feeling pretty normal. I get a phone call with great news. I'm on a high. 30 seconds later, I get ready to make my phone call to my seller, and literally, not only, I don't go back to my normal feeling, I go to that feeling of I'm sick. I'm physically ill. You guys know the feeling I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. Something is wrong. You can put it in other contexts. Somebody's called you, somebody in the family's sick or hurt or whatever. And I like heights of exhilaration, depths of despair. And the reason that I went so rapidly is because in between hanging up with my escrow company and the 30 seconds I was thinking about calling my seller, I had one of those moments, those oh crud moments. And the oh crud moment was, I think I forgot to tell escrow that we're doing a 1031 exchange, and the escrow is now closed, which, by the way, you don't undo these things. You don't unrecord escrows, okay? It's now recorded, and what did that mean to my client? It meant about a $40,000 tax hit. As much as I wanted to spend my $16,000 commission, I was a little short in coming up with the difference between my 16 and the 40. Okay? I'm sick. I'm just balled up. Oh my God, I know better this. I can't believe it. Why didn't I read my escrow instructions? How could I have let something, and by the way, this didn't happen in my first year or two of the business. I've been doing this for 12, 13 years, I think. I knew what I was doing, man. What's going on? All right? So at any rate, before I call my seller, I pull myself up off the floor. I call escrow company back and I say, Patty, please tell me that I told you that we were doing a 1031 exchange. And please tell me you did it. Oh yeah, of course, Lance, everything's taken care of, but the money's over to the exchange company. And wham! Okay? I instantly go back even above where I was even 60 seconds earlier. Now, I tell that story for two reasons. What you think, whether you believe it or not, will completely impact how you feel, how you respond to people, how you act, how you talk, how you look, the whole 9 yards. Okay? And quite honestly, if you can't control that a little bit in this business, it will kill you. As much fun as it is to be on those highs and as terrible as it is to be on those lows, I think very early on in this business, the more you learn to kind of control that, nothing wrong with getting really excited, but when you have that deal that's just, you get that phone call and you don't want to make or you just know, you got to control that. I honestly believe that's probably what drives more people out of this business than anything else. It's not so much can I make a living or not. It's those highs and lows. It'll wipe you out. And read your escrow instructions. That's the moral of the story. Okay, back to page 2. All right, home warranty plan. Somewhere in the contract it said someone's paying for a home warranty plan, right? Make sure the dollar amount is right and make sure the person paying for it is right. Very simple. Buyer's vesting. This is already the third time that this has been mentioned in the escrow instructions. Buyer's vesting, upon notification from buyers as to complete their vesting. They need to know that. Okay? Zone disclosure report. This is the natural hazard zone disclosure, natural hazard report, NHD. It says we need to get that. And what it also says is escrow holder could care less what it says. It's not a concern of the escrow, but it needs to be provided because we've asked for it. Structural pest control report. That's the termite report. Remember, the termite report is not called a termite report. The termite report is called a structural pest control report. It's called a structural pest control report because termite companies are governed by the Structural Pest Control Board. Okay, there's a little bit of trivia for you. Somewhere in the contract it said a termite report is to be provided and somebody's paying for it and someone's maybe or may not paying for repairs. Make sure that your contract and your escrow instructions match. Very simple. Buyer and property to qualify. What does that mean when it says the buyer and the property to qualify for a new loan? The buyer has to qualify in the form of, I have a job, I have income, I have the ability to make the payments. The property has to qualify in the form of the appraisal. Okay? If the property does not appraise either value-wise or condition-wise, well then guess what? Then the property does not qualify for the loan, therefore there is no loan. So it's not just all on the buyer, it's buyer and property. So they've got to qualify for their loan. Deposits receipt. The deposit receipt to be handed to escrow and all counter offers. Actually, it's kind of funny. We talked about this in the class. We don't call it the deposit receipt anymore. What do we call it? We call it the residential purchase agreement and joint escrow instructions. This actually is old language. That's kind of funny. I need to talk to Summer about that. That's what we used to call this right here is referring to the contract, not what it might read, because it says the deposit receipt. They're talking about the contracts, along with any counteroffers or addendums are to be basically turned into escrow. Preliminary title report. Very small little 4 sentences here, or 4 lines. Probably one of the single most important, yes, most commonly overlooked aspects of any real estate transaction. We're always worried about the contract, the buyer's loan, the appraisal, you know, getting the payoffs for the seller, getting the close of escrow date. We always tend to ignore the preliminary title. It's not very sexy. They're boring to read. They're almost as boring as escrow instructions. Preliminary title report can sink a deal just as easily as a bad loan. The good news with the preliminary title report, unlike a bad loan, sometimes bad loans go on for 30, 60. If we let them, they'll go on for 90 days or 2 years. Yeah, it's a little exaggeration, but you can have bad loans go on for a very long time because the buyer and their agent and the seller and their agent and the lender, they were all holding hands and we're praying, oh please, which by the way, if you have one transaction in escrow right now and that's the only escrow you have, do you tend to be a little more inclined to nurture and baby that escrow? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the bottom line is it's a bad thing. Okay? Great customer service, going the extra mile, doing everything you can for the client. I'm all for that. Taking a transaction which should be canceled and not canceling it because it's the only transaction that we have does not represent our clients very well or not. And there's a lot of that goes on in this business. A lot of that goes on in the business. Now, that happens a lot with loans. The good news about preliminary title reports killing deals is they're a fatal blow normally very quickly. Okay? If you read the title report. So if you read the prelim and the prelim says something terrible on it, you get the prelim in the very beginning. if it's something so terrible that it's going to be a deal killer, let's use my example of I want to buy the house and I want to put the swimming pool in, and the only reason I'm buying the house is because I want to put the swimming pool in because I'm going to train for the Olympics and blah, blah, blah. And I look at the preliminary title report, and the buyer's agent representing me looks at the easements and the setbacks, and it's obvious the entire backyard is covered by an easement, and there's no possible way I can put my swimming pool in there. That is a known fact in the very beginning. And that's more than likely a known fact that will never change. Now, if I read the preliminary title report the first day I get it, I discover that, I go to my client, I say, oh gosh, look at this, I'm so sorry. Is it a deal killer? Yes, it's a deal killer. I told you I gotta have to put a swimming pool in. Now we kill it now. You go back to the seller, oh, we're so sorry. Okay? If we don't read it at all, worst case, what's the worst case scenario on a transaction like that? Worst case scenario on a transaction like that is the buyer never reads the prelim. Do buyers read these things, by the way? They don't. Buyers traditionally don't read their escrow instructions. They don't read the preliminary title reports. They don't read their inspections. They don't read the CC&Rs. They certainly don't read the loan documents. They just sit down and sign away. Who's supposed to read these? We are. Well, the buyers and sellers are too, but we are. Especially using my swimming pool example. Buyer doesn't read it. I don't read it. We close escrow. Buyer goes down to the city of Moreno Valley, goes to pull a permit, and says, put my swimming pool in here. City pulls the permit, checks it out, maybe 2 weeks go by, and then somebody finally says, oh, sorry, you've got this easement here. What is this? Oh yeah, it's only been there for like 75 years. Nobody told me. Well, it was on your prelim. And who does the buyer then turn to with the wrath?
Us.
They turn to the realtor. They turn to us and say, Lance, you knew the only reason I bought the property is because I had to have the swimming pool. It was on the prelim. You knew. Did nobody read it? You can apply that example to 1,000 different things. You got to know your client. Probably this one of the, they're all important, but this is very important. Fire insurance. This is telling the buyer that they need to get fire insurance. Pretty straightforward. Prorations. We're going to do more on prorations when we work on net sheets. We're going to do a class on how to actually fill out a net sheet for the seller. How much money is it going to cost you to sell your house, minus the loan, how much money you're going to get. And we're also going to do an estimated closing sheet for buyers, and we're going to learn how to fill all that stuff out too. We'll do it the new school way on the computer, but we'll also teach you what they all mean. But the prorations are basically talking about taxes, insurance, homeowners association dues, rents, security deposits, all of that sort of stuff. All of those items are prorated through close of escrow. You need to understand this and be able to explain this to your clients, because you will have a client who will ask you, how do I prorate my mortgage payment? How do you prorate the homeowners? So we talked about this a little bit in the contracts class, and we'll talk about it more in the class when we do our net sheets and seller's estimated closing statements. But anyway, there's your prorations. Preliminary change of ownership. This is required by the government. The government says you have to fill out a form that says who is going to be selling and who is going to be buying. Why do they want to know that? Because this revenue and taxation code wants to follow the revenue and the taxation. Okay? If you have a buyer or a seller that says, I'm not interested and I won't fill out the preliminary change of ownership form, then they will not be buying or selling real estate, because it has to happen. Supplemental tax information. This was kind of covered on the first page, but this talks about the tax assessors. There's going to be taxes on the property taxes on the property at time of close of escrow. But also, as was always the case, property taxes are reassessed at close of escrow. I think the sales price on this one was 100 and whatever it was, 32 or whatever. So depending upon the county and city and everything where the property is located, this property would be reassessed at a value of the sales price. and the taxes will apply accordingly. Okay, so that's important. Who is that really important to know? That's the buyer. Very important for the buyer to know, and the buyer needs to have an expectation of what their property taxes are going to be. Okay, it's not. I was going to say it's funny. It's not really funny at all. But one of the painful truths of our real estate market over the last several years is, as our property values accelerated and just screamed up, and our $150,000 properties were selling for $500,000, and we had all of these wonderful, and I say wonderful, in quotes, financing programs that allowed these buyers to take advantage of interest only and all sorts of crazy things so that they could buy this $500,000 property and have a fairly reasonable entry-level payment, at least for a year or maybe two. But guess what wasn't reasonable? The property taxes, the insurance. So now you've got these people that have property tax bills that in some cases their property tax payments are more than their mortgage payments. Okay? And guess what? They're not used to that. And that's one of the reasons I think our market kind of fell as rapidly. It wasn't just the payments, it was the taxes, which is another reason why all of our city, county, state, and federal municipalities are in such trouble. When you have city, county, and state municipalities anticipating property tax revenues based on a $500,000 sales price and getting fat and happy and all the rest of that, and then the property tax base crushing down and those taxes not being paid at that level, but we've increased the budgets based upon this, do we have a problem? We got a big problem. Big problem. So anyway, the supplemental tax information talks about the property is going to be reassessed at the new value. Okay? And again, it's important that the buyers know that. Very, very important that the buyers know that. It also talks about tax bills issued after close of escrow shall be handled directly between buyer and seller. Does that happen on occasion? Yes, it does. There's some things that get crossed. And that's always fun. That's always fun dealing with stuff like that after close. 1099 reporting disclosure. This basically says you're never going to close an escrow that's not going to be subject to 1099 and IRS reporting. If you ever have a buyer or seller that says they can't do that, you don't have a buyer or seller. Okay? It's all subject to 1099 and tax reporting. Privacy Act notice. This is on a law, I think it was passed at some point, which in effect says the information, and you'll have buyers and sellers that are going to be very concerned about this. Escrow is going to ask for very sensitive information. They're going to have names, social security numbers, mailing address, loan account information, all sorts of stuff that we all worry about from an identity theft perspective. And this is basically saying that the escrow holder and everybody associated, including us, the realtors, we can only use that information for the purposes that it's been given to us. We're not allowed to go out, obviously, and steal someone's identity. But you'll get buyers and sellers that are very, very concerned about that. Good funds disclosure. This happens all the time. We'll use our example of we're trying to close this escrow by the last day of the year, December 30th, 2011, a Friday. Okay? There is no way in the world this escrow will close unless they have good funds. Okay? And good funds is simple. Good funds is wire transfer, always the best. Okay? Cashier's checks, certified cashier's checks, pretty good. That was kind of the gold standard. Kind of sort of used to be the certified funds in the form of a cashier's check. That's still very good. Escrow companies take those all the time. And I would probably say that there's probably more people that are still going down to the bank, getting a cashier's check for their closing funds and walking it into escrow than are wiring them. I tell you, we got to stop that. Let's start wiring everything. It's way better. It's easier to track. It's just, although it seems like we're always trying to chase down a wire at the last minute, most of the time when we're trying to chase down a wire at the last minute, the reason we're trying to chase it down is because the person who said they sent the wire didn't send the wire. Oh yeah, the buyer wired their funds last night. Well then where are they? Well, they didn't wire their funds last night. And they haven't wired them yet. And we find out, okay, I'm going to do it right now. Okay? But at any rate, you cannot, which by the way is cash good funds. Cash is not good funds. You cannot walk into an escrow company the day before you're supposed to close with a suitcase with $20,000 in cash in it. Oh, here's my, it's good, it says in God we trust, legal tender. Not for escrow purposes. We're not money launderers here, okay? So cash is not a good source of good funds in any form. I don't care if someone wants to give you cash for an earnest money deposit. Hey, here's $1,000 in cash as my deposit. No. We don't do cash. Wire or cashier's check. California new withholding tax law. Okay? This is, well, it says new. It's not really new. This is goes back 8 years now. And it basically talks about out-of-state sellers. And there's a variety of things as it relates to the tax law. I'm not going to get into specific details about this. But depending upon certain triggers within the sales price and certain things that the seller may or may not do, if the seller is in-state or out-of-state, that the seller may be subject to a withholding tax of 3 1/3% of the sales price. Which means depending upon whether your seller meets the requirements, escrow may have to withhold 3 1/3% of the sales price out of the seller's proceeds. Now this also assumes that the seller has proceeds. Okay? Obviously REOs this doesn't apply, short sales this doesn't apply. But if you have a seller with equity and they basically fall into one of these scenarios, escrow holder may be responsible to withhold 3 1/3% of the sales price out of their proceeds. And the reason they're doing that is they want to, the state of California wants to make sure that the seller pays their taxes that are due in the state of California. You have a seller that sells their property in California, maybe they're moving to Nevada. They really don't plan on coming back to California. California kind of does the settlement statement, and oh, by the way, when they move out of California, guess what they don't do in California? They don't file their tax return in California. So California does it for them and says, hey, by the way, you owe us money. Well, we don't have any money on file and the seller has moved to Nevada. California is having a hard time getting that money back. So what they've said is, well, we're going to take it in advance. We're going to take 3 1/3% in advance. Even if you don't owe anything, then they'll give it back to you. Okay? But they're taking it in advance in case you do. So if you have yes.
I see that law was put in, it says January 1st, 2003.
Yep.
I'm kind of offended from a personal liberty standpoint.
Right.
Why should we be doing the work of the state of California when they have 1 million people that are supposed to collect these taxes?
Right.
I mean, it seems like they're throwing a burden onto our industry that unless I'm naive, I don't think there are too many other businesses that they have to go out and collect taxes for the state of California.
Well,
is that unrealistic?
No, it's not, and it's maybe a little too simple. Having said that, it's actually even worse than that, because they're collecting a tax in advance which may not even be due. Okay? You want to really get riled up? Let's give you this one. Let's suppose we close escrow on January 1 of 2012. And let's suppose our seller is subject to 3 1/3% withholding. So we close escrow January 1 of next year. Seller gets their proceeds less however much money that is. That money is sent to the state of California. The seller knows, because they have filed their taxes and they know that everything's good and they know they have no tax due. They know that that money is going to ultimately be returned. By the way, it is a withholding tax, okay? Okay? So the seller knows that they are going to have no tax due. We closed escrow January 1 of 2012. It's in the 2012 tax year that they paid the 3 1/3. They have to wait until the following year, into 2013, to file their 2012 tax return to then basically
Get their money
say,
back.
to get their money back. Okay? So the state of California, in that scenario, could basically be holding on to and utilizing that money in the general fund for over a year before the seller even has the ability to file the 2012 tax return, show that they don't have any taxes due, and then get a refund. Now, that's a tough deal. So, but that's not new. That's been 8 years. It's been 8 years under the law. Federal withholding. This is the FERPTA stuff. Okay, and again, very similar type stuff. Now, having said that, most of the time this is all taken care of by filling out the proper forms, and you can, by the way, go to the state of California and fill out a waiver form. Escrow has to fill it in and all of that. There's all other things that can be done that make this sound so sinister, that make it a little less sinister. But at any rate, all real estate transactions are subject to taxation. That's what your buyers and sellers need to understand. And to be honest with you, I would prefer that you not spend a lot of time explaining these two paragraphs to your buyers and sellers. Give them the basics, and then what do? We are not attorneys, and we are not tax advisors. If you have some concerns about the federal and state withholding tax, contact your tax preparer. Correct? That is the correct answer. Now, I want you to have a general understanding of this, but to be blunt, I really don't want you going into much depth with your client explaining this to them, because even if you're right, it's not our job. We're not and not only is it not our job, we're treading on thin ice. So stay away from that. Affiliated services. In this particular affiliated service agreement, again, these are escrow instructions that are through our in-house escrow company. So this is telling the buyer and the seller that Coldwell Banker Town and Country has business relationships with certain third parties, yada, 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 yada. And actually, looking at this actually should say Coldwell Banker Pioneer Real Estate, Coldwell Banker Town and Country, and Coldwell Banker Realty Center. I've got to clean that up a little bit. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I take that back. And it talks about our parent company. Never mind. It talks about our parent company, Pioneer Real Estate Inc. This is basically disclosing to the buyer and the seller that in this particular transaction, if they use Town and Country Escrow, that Town and Country Escrow is owned by the brokerage that's involved representing one of the parties. That has to be done. Same thing with whether it's a mortgage. We have a relationship with Supreme Lending Corporation, and we have those type of relationships established. This is very common when you're going to have these things, even if you're using a non-broker owned escrow, even if you're using a Department of Corporations, a DOC escrow, you may see, and I'm going to this is not a true example, I'm just going to hypothetically make something, First American Title Company, it has affiliated relationships with A, B, C, D, and it lists a whole bunch of other companies. Maybe some mortgage arms, maybe a default servicing arm, so on and so forth. So it's not uncommon to see a massive amount of affiliated service disclosures. Okay, we kind of talked about this in the very beginning. Escrow instructions not to supersede. Okay, so now they're just clarifying for everybody that the escrow instructions are executed for the sole purpose of enabling the escrow holder to complete the transaction. And this is, you need to remember this in all of your escrow instructions. I don't care what company you're doing business with, need to have this language. They are not intended to amend, modify, supersede, or in any way change the the contract entered into by the parties, and here are two dated in these instructions. Okay? Clear as day. So if you do have a mistake, even if all parties sign the mistake, point them back to this paragraph. Okay? Notwithstanding any provisions to the contrary, containing these escrow instructions or supplements from escrow shall not be responsible in any way whatsoever for the sufficiency, validity, or correctness of any of the signature of any of principals. So what this is saying is, escrow is not responsible to verify who are these people. Okay? Now, if there's a notary involved, then there's going to be some identification or notary process involved. But that's really not a function of escrow. Someone signs this at the bottom, escrow. There's no notary. You don't notarize escrow instructions. Okay? You know, if you're a real estate agent who makes a practice of calling your seller and saying, hey, I got my escrow instructions here, I need to get these in, I'm just going to initial them for you and send them in. Are you kidding me? Escrow wouldn't know. They're not going to sit down with these clients. And obviously we don't do that. Seller only. Okay? The foregoing terms and provisions of these escrow instructions are provided or accepted in their entirety and concurred with by me. That's the seller. I will hand you necessary documents called for. This is basically some instructions to the seller that are specific to the seller. Paying off their loan, taking care of liens, transfer taxes, so on and so forth. Cancellation fee. If the most escrow instructions have cancellation fees. Okay? You get into this escrow, which by the way, escrow and title and mortgage, the compensation model for those businesses is very similar to realtors. We all get paid upon close of escrow. Okay? Now, escrow has kind of come up with a cute little way to say, hey, we've done a little bit more work than you guys, which probably isn't true. But in the event you do cancel this, we want some money. Cancellation fee for escrows, $250, $350, $450, something like that. Okay? A lot of escrow companies will enforce it, and then many won't. Okay? The big challenge for canceling escrow is who pays for it. And normally the person who ends, if there is a cancellation fee paid, normally the person who ends up paying for it a lot of times is the buyer, because it comes out of their earnest money deposit. So at any rate, okay, now if you can see this, we're at the end of our escrow instructions. Okay? We've got some memorandum in here, matter of information. Who are the agents? In this particular case, Coldwell Banker Pioneer Real Estate, Century 21 Team Realty. There's the end, and there may be one or two other things. Maybe it might mention who the lender is or whatever it happens to be. Those are the end of the memorandums, and now we're going to start signing. Okay? Buyer sign, seller sign, pretty straightforward. Initial on the bottom. Then you get these. I'm not going to go through these line by line. Every single escrow company has what they call the general provisions. This is the fine print. Okay? What this really is all about, there's a tremendous amount of law. Just like there's law that governs realtors and how we conduct ourselves when it comes to handling a real estate transaction. There's a tremendous amount of the same type of law that applies to how an escrow is to be handled. This is the fine print. This is the legalese. This deals with all of those little contingencies involved with the transaction. This does not amend or modify or tweak any terms that the buyers and sellers have agreed to. Probably the most common thing, and I'm not sure where it's at in here because this is 4 pages. I'm just going to buzz right through it. But one of the most common items that's addressed in here is, what do you do with security deposits if there's not a and I don't know where it's at in here, but it's in there somewhere. Okay, but it doesn't have to be in there because it's in the contract. If there is a dispute that revolves around a cancellation, and there is a security deposit, an earnest money deposit in escrow, the contract says that escrow is instructed to disperse the deposit based upon mutually agreeable signed instructions, mutually agreeable by both parties. Buyer and seller sign, and escrow is told what to do. So, bottom line is, and again, we spent an hour and 45 minutes basically having me read a basic set of escrow instructions to you. Okay? Now, we filled in a lot of information with a few explanations here or there, but the key to this is read them. If you're not going to read them, you're going to find yourself in trouble. Now, I'm going to briefly show you just a couple of minutes. This is a set of escrow instructions on a different file, and it's basically the same type of information, except if you're doing a short sale, which is in vogue these days, okay, you're going to find some additional language in your escrow instructions that deal with the short sale. The language is going to be similar to what you have here. Most of this language is basically dictated by the lender involved in the transaction. That would be the seller's lender, the mortgage holder, okay? And in this particular one, the obvious one that jumps out here right in bold is sellers hereby acknowledge that they will receive no proceeds through this transaction, okay? So you're going to find modifications within escrow instructions to fit the specific type of transaction you're doing. Short sale escrows have specific short sale language in there. In most cases, escrows involving REOs, there may be some mention that the bank is Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or it's a bank or something like that. But they're typically treated just like regular escrows. There's really nothing particularly special about it. But the short sale escrows are handled a little bit differently. Probate, certainly going to have a lot of language that revolves around the probate rules and the law, and whether there's court confirmation or verification and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So you need to be prepared for all of those eventualities when it comes to your escrow instructions. And basically, in wrapping up, probably the most important part of this entire class, if you've gotten anything out of it, is what I said in the very beginning. You need to develop a very strong, close working relationship with your escrow officer, okay? Especially if you're new to the business. You know, if you're new to the business, your escrow officer can be a more valuable, I hate to say this, but it's the truth, they can be a more valuable resource to you than maybe even your broker or your manager, okay? Because as much as your broker or your manager's income is tied to your success, and they should be there, and hopefully we are there for you during these processes, the escrow officer, they're looking at you as the client. As much as their buyer and seller are truly the client, and that's who they have the fiduciary duty to represent and make sure that the escrow is handled properly, the buyer and seller. In most cases, the buyer and seller are not necessarily going to be the source of a tremendous amount of repeat business. You as the realtor are going to be the source of repeat business. So the escrow officers, trust me, they will bend over, the good ones, the good escrow officers, they will bend over backwards to help you. Call them, lean on them. I don't understand this. Lance said something about this and it didn't sound right. Could you help me out? Maybe I said something wrong. Talk to your escrow officer. Have them I'm telling you, they will spend as much time with you going through this as you need, okay? Because they want to be that person. Good escrow officers are not Monday through Friday 9 to 5. Good escrow officers will give you their cell phones. You'll be able to reach them at the back line at the office after hours. They'll be working in the evenings. They'll be working on the weekends. They'll be available to you, okay? Because they want that business. Okay, I'm basically done. Anybody got any thoughts or questions or? No?
Thank you.
We've had enough?
Thank you.
Day 3 in the books? Okay. we accept the California Residential Purchase Contract, the RPA, as the escrow instructions, and that's what we're going to use, okay? Now, even though they may give you this acceptance letter, they'll give you 25 pages of more stuff, okay? And in this particular case, of the 25 pages, they're actually giving us a copy of the original CAR form, the counteroffer form, and the whole 9 yards. So they've incorporated the offer into the escrow instructions because it is the escrow instructions. Now, that's really going to be a function of who is going to be the escrow company. If it's a concern to you one way or the other, ask them in advance. I will tell you, generally speaking, it doesn't matter. Okay, it should not really, it doesn't matter to me as the broker whether the escrow company sends you an acceptance letter saying we accept the contract as the escrow instructions, or whether the escrow company sends you what most escrow companies do. They go back to the way we've always done it, which is, and it seems a little silly, what they'll do is they'll take the purchase contract and they basically copy the pertinent pieces of the purchase contract out and they put it into their own escrow instructions. You'll find most escrow companies prefer to type their own escrow instructions, frankly because they don't trust us agents. They don't trust that we've done a good job with the purchase contract. And frankly, they're probably, in some cases, they're probably proven right. So, in this particular case, we've got a basic set of escrow instructions. This is from our in-house escrow. Summer's our escrow officer, which, by the way, speaking of kind of tying into the way we ended yesterday's class on presenting offers, if you are not developing close relationships with the escrow officer you're doing business with, and their assistants, and their receptionists, and all the rest of that, you're missing out, okay? It's just as important, and in many cases more important, for you to have a good, close working relationship with your escrow officer as it is with the other agent on the other side of the fence, okay? A good escrow officer will make you a lot of money. A bad escrow officer will lose you money, okay? They can save deals for you, they can kill deals for you. You need them to go the extra mile, you need something recorded, you need something ran to title. Well, maybe that's a title issue, well maybe, maybe not. You have a great relationship with the escrow officer, but maybe in this particular transaction you don't have a great relationship with whoever the title company is. But guess who does have a good relationship with the title company? Your escrow officer. Hey, Summer, I really need a favor. Can you move the earth and the sun and the stars on this deal to get this thing recorded? Or can you get this done for me? So, again, that relationship is important. And even if it's an escrow you've never done business with, I strongly recommend, just like we said, go to the listing agent's office if you're representing the buyer, introduce yourself. It's not a bad idea to go to the escrow company, introduce yourself, put a name. It's amazing what people will do for you when they put a face to you, okay? And it's also amazing what they'll do when they put a voice to you. You send them an email, there's no connection. I got to tell you, develop those relationships. So at any rate, so here's our escrow. In this particular case, this is a broker-owned escrow. This is our closures, okay? Because right off the bat, you could potentially realize there was a mistake that was made. Initial deposit. This should come straight off of the purchase contract, purchase agreement, the RPA. If the contract says $2,500, bam, we've got $2,500, okay? Deposit prior to close of escrow. Now, be careful with the language. Previously, when we were talking in the purchase contract, I made a distinction between earnest money deposit and down payment. Okay, I made a very succinct differential between earnest money deposit and the balance of the down payment. In this set of escrow instructions, it doesn't really make a distinction between the two. What it does say is initial deposit, $2,500. Deposit, buyer, think of it this way. The buyer is to deposit prior to close of escrow, $7,275, which basically in this particular case is giving us, actually maybe I might take that what I just said.
No.
That may very well be additional deposit, okay? I don't have the contract to see, but if that's what the contract says, so be it. Now we have total cash through escrow, and they're asking for an additional, oh, I take that back, never mind. The total cash through escrow is both of those items listed. So in effect, this is probably a FHA deal. Maybe we'll figure that out a little bit farther down when we get into the instructions. But the total amount of money that the buyer is asking to be put forward so far is $9,755, $775. That should be what shows up on page 1 of the purchase contract. If that's not, then you already have a problem. The loan, new encumbrance, everybody knows encumbrance, first trustee, second trustee, third trustee, in this case, one loan. The loan is $132,725. That should be what appears on page 1 of the purchase contract, purchase agreement, okay? So if these numbers aren't matching up, then you have a problem. Getting back to our prior example when we had that offer that was written and it appeared as though it was written all cash, right? Okay? If the buyer's agent, well, the buyer's agent obviously wrote it incorrectly. The listing agent accepts it, right? Then they send that purchase contract over to escrow. Escrow types this up. There's no place on that contract that said first trustee. Escrow automatically has a problem. So right from the very beginning there's an issue, which is why it's so important to have that correct. Okay? Now obviously total consideration, that's your sales price. You add them up and you've got $142,500. All of this information should come straight off page 1 of your contract. If you do it wrong, you're already off to a challenging start. Okay, now this reads basically as if, think of it as escrow instructions. I'm instructing you to do something. That's how this kind of reads. This is basically talking in the form of the buyer, the seller, in the form of the escrow. Furthermore, or in addition to these terms, we've got a few more things that we got to talk about. Okay? I will. All right, guys, we're going to get started. We're going to do our session today is on escrow instructions. Another relatively dry topic, so we're going to try to spice it up as much as we can. But again, somewhat of a dry topic. Now, if you're watching this on the video, we've got 2 videos that you need to watch before you watch this one. And that's going to be the contracts class, purchase agreement and contracts, and then the offer negotiation and presentation class, because it kind of flows into this. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about with the escrow instructions literally flows from the contracts we've done. So with that in mind, what I have on the screen, I've got basically 7 pages of standard escrow instructions. When I say standard, this is the typical run-of-the-mill boilerplate escrow. Okay. Now, one thing. Let me pull this up and let's back up just a little bit. When we were meeting yesterday, and we did our contract offer presentation class. Let me just pull up an example. On our purchase contract, at the top of our purchase contract has the find this.
Sure.
Okay. California residential purchase contract and joint escrow instructions. Okay. The purchase contract is the escrow instructions. All right. Having said that, most escrow companies, and frankly including ours, including Town and Country Escrow, which is broker owned, we don't really acknowledge the contract as the escrow instructions. We acknowledge the fact that that's what the intent is, but in effect what we're going to do, and you're going to see this in the escrow instructions, we're going to restate a whole bunch of things. Okay? So for example, matter of fact, let me show you a different way of doing it. Let me show you if you have an escrow company that will use the purchase contract as the escrow instructions, you will get instructions that look a little bit more similar. Is this the one I want? I don't think so. No, it's not. Let's try this one. Okay. You'll get an instruction that looks more similar to what this is. And this is an escrow acceptance letter. from Chicago Title. Again, this is an old one. This goes back to 2005, but more or less it's the same. And the escrow acceptance letter is basically going to be a letter from the escrow company that says, we've opened the escrow and we are accepting your language in the purchase agreement, in this particular case, page 7, paragraph 26A. Now keep in mind, this is a little old, the contract has changed, so the numbers may be a little bit different. But the concept basically is the same. Escrow is saying, or escrow instructions, so you will have language like a non-independent broker-owned escrow. That just says that we're broker-owned. If you're dealing with ABC escrow or Department of Corporations type escrow, then you'll have those words independent, non-broker-owned escrow, basically is what they're referring to there. Not necessarily a big deal, but you'll know you're dealing with a broker-owned escrow if you see the words non-independent and if you see a Department of Real Estate license number in there somewhere, okay? So if you're dealing with our escrow in-house, you're going to see that. If you are dealing with, you know, ABC Realty's escrow company, you're going to see that for them. Otherwise, of course, the big boys, you know, First American and Chicago, those are all DOC escrows, okay? To throw some acronyms around that you may or may not be familiar with, new real estate agents always get embarrassed because someone will throw out a 3 or 4 letter acronym and oh yeah, of course, you know, I understand that. Okay, DOC escrow, DOC Department of Corporations, okay? So if you're in that exchange back and forth with another agent and they ask the question, well, is the escrow DOC Department of Corporations? That's all they're talking about. Separate, independent, third party, and what that means is the escrow is not supervised isn't the word I'm looking for, regulated by the Department of Corporations, okay? If it is a DRE escrow, DRE Department of Real Estate, what that means is that the escrow itself is a broker-owned escrow, like ours is, and we are regulated by the Department of Real Estate, not the Department of Corporations. So there's some alphabet soup for you on what the acronyms mean, okay? Now normally, when you're looking at escrow instructions, you'll find that normally the first page of the escrow instructions almost looks exactly the same. There is a fairly strict boilerplate language that all escrow companies use. And they normally start off exactly the same way, identifying who is the buyer, who is the seller, and one of the questions that came up in our previous class is, how is the buyer going to hold title? What is their vesting going to be? So in this particular case, we've got Raul and Donnie Robles, vesting to be determined prior to close of escrow, hereinafter known as buyer. Do we already have an amendment that needs to be drawn? We already have an amendment that needs to be drawn in this escrow. Now, is this common? Very common. But frankly, why not figure this out before you write the contract, before you open the escrow? Because right off the bat, there's another piece of paper that's going to need to be generated, and you're going to have to sit down at some point, or at least ask your buyer to open up an email and sign and return. If you had known what Mr. and Mrs. Robles' vesting was going to be, it would say in there, you know, Robles as husband and wife as joint tenants, whatever it happens to be. But we've already got, kind of like we were trying not to generate a counter offer to the offer, well, we've already got at least one amendment to the escrow instructions, and we haven't even got past the first one. So, at any rate, in my opinion, and again, this is happening all the time. This doesn't make the buyer's agent a bad agent, but it would be a lot more efficient if they had had that information in advance. Now they got to chase it down. Okay, so we got to figure out what the buyer's vesting is going to be. They agree to purchase the property from Mr. and Mrs. Owner, Mr. and Mrs. Co. Now, title already knows what their vesting is, and they've even listed it, husband and wife as joint tenants. Where did title get that? Probably got it off of a prelim or some sort of title information. So they pulled it up. Normally, this, from a listing agent's perspective, it's not really something that's really important for us to gather at the time we're selling the property. Oh, by the way, I'm listing your house. How do you guys hold title? I suppose it would be interesting to know, but it's not really the type of thing that I, as in a normal course of taking a listing, really care about. If I needed to know it, I can call title. We can have it instantly because it's all a matter of public record. So the escrow officer pulled that up. Husband and wife, joint tenants, that's the seller. And they are hereinafter referred to as the seller. You have the real property set forth herein on the terms and conditions and considerations and instructions hereinafter stated, yada, yada, yada. The seller and the buyer shall deliver these signed escrow instructions to Town and Country Escrow, hereinafter referred to as escrow holder. Now, we talked yesterday in the previous class about contract, okay? The California Residential Purchase Agreement, purchase contract, is the legally binding contract. Nowhere in the escrow instructions, go back up to the top, will you find the word contract. This is not a contract, okay? The contract between the buyer and seller is the purchase contract, the purchase agreement, the RPA, okay? So the reason I point that out is if there is a conflict between the contract and the escrow instructions, the contract always prevails, okay? If for some reason the buyers and the sellers end up suing each other and they end up in court, the judge is not going to say, give me a copy of your escrow instructions, okay? Probably not interested in even seeing a copy of the escrow instructions. They're going to want to see what the contract says, okay? Because this is not a contract between the buyer and the seller. These are exactly what the title says. These are instructions to the escrow holder. Neutral, third party, unbiased party that basically does what they're told. If you do this, then do that. If that happens, then do this. And then ultimately, the end goal is to do what? Close the deal. So if all of these things happen in the instructions, then the escrow holder is instructed to close the deal. If these things don't happen in the instructions, then the deal don't close. So again, this is not a contract, but now I don't have the purchase contract to mirror the escrow instructions, but let's pretend we do, and let's pretend for at least page 1 that the data is correct. This is why you will hear me say over and over and over in all of these classes, read the paperwork, read the contract, read the escrow instructions, read the preliminary title report, read the inspections, read the whatever, the disclosure.